running, perfect. And I'm still assuming you're seeing that clearly.
100%.
Very good. And excellent. And that's a different tie between my and a different doesn't matter. Okay, where are we at? Single subject matter today, and you have it up on the screens there in front of you. There's quite a bit on this, so we'll power through it until we get to the end of it. Again, like any function or any aspect of business, everything comes down to money. Two things, as I always say in life, that everyone understands. Well, love and money. I'm not here to lecture on love. On money, I can do. And this is the point. Everything is measured, no matter what kind of as I said, function you're in. When you want to present any kind of a business case or any kind of initiative or program or continuous improvement or tweaking and so on, you bring it down to the euros. People understand it across the board, and particularly when you're trying to sell an improvement to your peers or to your management. And this applies probably more so inside in supply chain management. Why? Simply because it has the vast majority of resources in any organization, has the largest proportion. Some in a traditional manufacturing company, you would say up to 80% of resources are tied up in supply chain. That includes inbound logistics, outbound logistics, and of course the main part of operations. So what we're going to look at, we're going to look at the data side of things to a point, and how we and the importance of it, and also the different categories and why we look at migrating data up into information that makes sense to us as mere mortals. And then look at the supply chain finance connection, obviously, and you will see some elements of material that I spoke about before coming up. I purposefully have them included here for that reason. And then obviously the implications of supply chain, so where a simple change can impact, which further underpins the finance, I should say, methodology or approach that I already mentioned, specifically the DuPont pyramid. You'll see how this can be extremely powerful. And then financial implications for the supply chain itself. So let's start with this diagram here. And it's quite important to understand that we collect data left, right, and center. Anything that moves virtually nowadays is tracked or trapped in terms of data, and it's the lowest form of that you can get, whether it is a barcode, what do you call it? Those. Oh God.
Sensor.
QR code.
Yeah. I think they're the ones I'm talking about. You know, the ones with like the little square, like a QR code. Jesus, yeah. Memory's going already. QR codes, barcodes, and even simple numbers. If you were to go down to a stock room and do a physical count, you have a count of items there. That's a piece of data, and that's the lowest form. Then, of course, the metric. So if you have X number of items in stock, we say 27 items in stock, and you know that they cost you €2 each, that's 54 euros. Sounds simple, but that's a metric. So we can identify metrics, and then we put this into a category or an index, and that's how the hierarchy of data, information, and then knowledge, essentially, this is how it all comes together. So we know that we have the stock, we know we have 54 euros worth. We can then extrapolate how much money we need to sell those for, or how much we bought it from, because we have other data in other parts of the system and so on. So we can start creating these layers of metadata or additional information and so on. So by multiplying one against the other, we come up with an index, and that's exactly what we have here. So for in this example, in an index, combines two or more metrics into a single indicator, usually used to track trends in the output of a process. and hence you end up with logistics and the so-called perfect order. Does it exist? Probably does, some places. But in any case, the fact that we can use these indices, we can see based on past performances, we have some level of predictability into future performances and of particular processes. And keep this always in mind. No matter what it is, the process is always broken down into input, transform, and output. Always reduce everything to that level. It always works. And there's only, as I said, the only other element to that simple equation, one direction equation, is the feedback. Now technically you can have two levels of feedback: if output back into the process itself and output back into the input. So in any case, you have a feedback loop. That simple diagram, or that, if you have it mentalized at this stage, that simple diagram is a system. After that, it's just layers and layers and layers on top of that system, hence complex systems. Hence you have an organization which is a complex adaptive environment. Sounds like great terminology and so on and so forth, but strip it all down, there is no complexity. I don't see complexity in anything. Why? Because I strip everything down. I have to make it simple. Maybe it's my mind, I don't know, but most people will do that anyway, to not to be frightened by stuff that they see in front of them, or overwhelmed or awestruck. Taking this a step further, we also need to have categories, and there's categorizations of performance measures. They're either qualitative or quantitative. Now, those of you who may even be considering going on to further education beyond this will be coming across this in terms of research methods. You may be already looking at some of this, and I don't know, you have some project, I think, this semester as well to be doing. You may have already been introduced to certain levels of research methodology. That's just the academic way of trying to say, show me how you got to where you are. Show me the data. Again, my simple approach on it, the Jerry Maguire, show me the data. Okay, and this is what this comes down to. Is it quantitative? Is it easy to understand? Encourages appropriate behavior? Is it visible? And of course, is it defined and mutually understood? And that's important when we're looking at metrics and data. God only knows how many people can get confused with the stuff you see at 6 o'clock in the news every evening with respect to the whole COVID situation. Numbers and numbers and numbers. And the changing. You'd almost say that the goalposts are being changed every other week in terms of metrics. Some truth in that, but there's also behind it, if you read into it a bit more, it's the fact that there is better understandings of what's happening in those types of situations. So they're adapting. And that's important. Even in the real world, you'll have to adapt processes and adapt data to other influences and external. And that's the beauty about having a thorough understandings of your processes, because no process is perfect. There is always room for improvement. That's why we have Six Sigmas going on and so on in the organizations.
Mark, would you use data much in your own business, or
Absolutely.
like,
Point.
whereabouts would you use it? I suppose most, or
Um, Turnaround times, lead times, because we have, for example, stuff coming from both far and near, we have to be able to calculate our delivery dates and then changes of prices in transit. And then how much of this can we absorb, or do we need to up the price before the stuff even arrives into the country? That's one example of in the supply chain. I consult with a number of companies on a private basis, and we use data, we collect data about the management team, about I'll use the word perceptions, but this is where I try to convert perceptions into some levels of reality by getting various types of tests that I carry out with the staff and so on. Something like, if you've come across your 360 performance, but far more advanced than that, because out of that I can end up with a graph which tells me if If you think you're a great communicator and your team thinks, "Well, no, he's not such a great communicator," you can come up, or in particular instances where they can communicate. Some people like to deal with people one to one and are extremely good. Other people can appeal to the mass audience, and on a one to one basis, they're uncomfortable. Even down to those levels, we can actually calculate and beyond people's behaviors, and based on that, then we can say, well, what you think you know about yourself and what the general populace or population of staff think is different. Now we put an interaction or an intervention in place. So there's I would have to put hand on heart and say that I'm very much a numbers person. At the same time, as I said to you before, you have to be able to see the granularity of it, and at the same time come way back up and say, well, are there other instances or issues that can be impacting on the data or impacting on the process, and then fine tune. And that, in actual fact, that's even represented in a research methodology known as grounded theory. Now, very few students, if any, use that. That's generally left to more advanced doctor level, and the reason being is that, and the way to simplify it while I'm talking about this, if you've ever seen one, you know those little toys that you would have had when you were a kid, and you change it and they have different colors, a kaleidoscope type thing. Well, every time you look at it, there's a different shape and so on, and you can keep spinning around and trying, and you might eventually see that, after 27 spins or something like that, coincidentally picking that number twice today, you might notice that you get triangles as opposed to squares and rectangles. You're beginning to notice patterns forming, not necessarily the physical, but a pattern is repeating itself after time, and we start to group those. And eventually, or if you have colored sand and you start to mix it around, you'll never get the same colors twice, but you'll get hints of similarities in patterns. That's where we start to build up layers and layers and layers of metadata and on. So we know then, and we use that because you will have different perceptions, different comments from people, different influences. So we try to adapt to all of these. So we put the process in place, and the process has to be not necessarily watertight, but has to be as appropriate and adaptable to support the data that you're trying to present. So technically you use the process first and the data then emerges. But in any case, yes, we would use this. And as I said, I would be a Jerry Maguire, show me the numbers. But at the same time, this is the whole point. You have to be able to get out of that one particular aspect and evaluate everything else that could be potentially impacting. That's why one of the reasons why, for example, supply chain and particularly the transportation systems are so fascinating in terms of the data, where they're collecting it from. Street cameras, radio reports. It was a Dublin City Radio produces. They were one of the first to start using traffic reports and your system in your cars here in Ireland. It took us for years to get that before you get the interruption onto your radio station saying there's a roadblock on such and such a place. Avoid, take this route and take that route. That's been available in other countries for donkey's years. So we have real-time data. So assimilating and collecting real-time data that affects and the transportation. So some of the more advanced ones are quite capable of adapting all these other variables, including weather and so on and so forth. Where would all of this have come from? Things like Formula One sports and so on, looking at the weather forecast before a race starts, what tires would they wear or so on, and trying to get down to within kilometers of the track to be able to predict the performance of the car and the changes in temperatures and so on. So all this type of data, it's all quantifiable data. And based on that, then, and the more data from the different perspectives we have, the better our information. Ultimately, the better decisions we'll make.
Mark, do you find that working with different companies, obviously they have data, but sometimes they don't, how would I say, have the right analysis or the insights out of the data, and that's the piece where the value lies. So they have reams and reams of data, but not actually able to glean the insights out of it.
Absolutely, Barry. But bear with me, because this kind of comes up in terms of the what to measure. This is covered shortly, but perfect. Absolutely, it's often a case that we're looking at the wrong stuff, or we don't have the stuff, and that becomes another challenge. But we'll come on to that now in shortly. Okay. So as I say, moving on to point 6 there, as you can see there, we talk about encompass inputs and outputs, exactly the transformation process, inputs transform and outputs, measures only what is important. Kind of moving into the realms of what you're asking about there, Barry, is multidimensional, being able to look at it from all different perspectives. These are the criteria for good measures. Uses economies of effort, and then it just facilitates trust. Do you believe in the numbers? Now, these are the points that you've raised, Barry, in this area, and we'll go through them. Measure only what's important. Now, this is one of the biggest traps we can fall into, measuring everything. And ultimately, we have reams and reams or gigabits and terabits of storage of taken up measuring stuff that's probably useless. So we need to know, what do we want to try and measure and why? So you have to be able to stand back, and that's why it's so important to have a thorough understanding of the business you're in. I was giving a lecture on leadership the other day, and one of the criteria of good leadership is the knowledge of the business you're in. And unfortunately, we do have people that are in senior roles in organizations who don't actually know how their products are actually made. They'll sell them, for example, and say, this is a great piece of stuff, but tell me the details, and they can't. I mean, it's not uncommon, that type of problem. And the reason is that, and then when we go to collect all of this data, you need to know why it affects you. One of the guiding principles that I use is that what are your strategic objectives? Now we begin to see a little bit of overlap. I think is it with Gail? Is it in her? Does Gail teach you?
Strategic marketing.
Yeah, strategic marketing. Have you who do you have strategic management or the strategic management?
Yeah, we had Peter there.
Peter Bean.
John. Yeah.
Peter Meehan, is it?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Good man, Peter. Yeah. Peter, he will have brought you to these processes, and he will have mentioned in also the strategic objectives and strategic goals. And that's where, when they are clearly articulated and communicated to the organization, as you're moving down the echelons, we'll take the operations manager, he'll be able to extrapolate, well, what's important in my section that supports those goals, or what do I need to introduce? And that's what he needs to measure, not everything else that moves. Okay, don't measure, because it's time wasting. And more importantly, because we have so many mechanisms to be able to trap data and so on, that costs money as well. You know, even if it's down to a simple thing like scanners and so on, putting a scanning system in place is not cheap. And then gathering the data, storing the data, backing it up using your IT system or outsourced IT system to back up your system. Is it every 24 hours? Is it once a month? Is it once a week? Or if the business I was in, telecoms, was a couple of times a day, stacking up terabits of, or storing terabits of live data. And also you would have had legal requirements. So I'm not even going to go in that area, but certain data you have to store. Or, for example, I don't know how many of you do your manufacturing returns to CSO and revenue and so on, and their systems aren't the best, to be honest with you. It's time consuming, but when you have the data there, it does help. But sometimes that data is obsolete. You know, and what they're looking for may be a little bit obsolete, but nevertheless they want to be able to know, well, what's the manufacturing index and so on, and to underpin economic growth or otherwise, and the manufacturing happiness index and all that sort of stuff, and purchasing index, all indices give us some indication of trends of what way things are going. So measure only what is important. That's why it's as I said, there's a lot more behind it than actually meets the eye. Why do you want to measure this stuff? What's important to the company? What's important to the strategic objectives of the company in terms of their goals? And then you don't measure everything all at once. There has to be a logic progression of what you want to achieve. And that's why, for example, we have project management in place, or program management, such that we have a stepped and phased approach. In other words, breaking these strategic objectives goals down into small, manageable, understandable chunks. in project management terms, work breakdown structures or activities. That way we can say, yeah, this is what we have to do to get that result. This is what we have to do to get that result, and so on, so on, so on. This 8th point, multi-dimensional, that's the, as I call it, the MBA approach. And that's why you need to have an understanding of other functions inside an organization. That's one way of looking at it. Such that if you're a pure techie person and you're you're running production lines, or you're up in IT and you're turning out stuff, what's the financial perspective of this? What are the implications? What are the implications from an HR perspective, in terms of competencies, capabilities, core competencies, and so on? What are the impacts from competitors? And also, what are the impacts from opportunities? Do we need to move in a different direction? So we need to be able to assimilate all of these different dimensions or perspectives to enable us to make the right decisions. But the data can trigger us to do some of this. So we might look at certain things, we might look at, if we take the ordering process, and we might say that, we're missing our orders. We're on average running 3 days, 4 days, or 2 weeks over our delivery date. What's happening here? So that prompts things to start a reverse engineer of the process and say, well, what's happening? One of my students some years ago down in EMC Square down in Cork wrote his thesis on precisely that area. Even though they were producing very high-end computing systems, it was the downtime between processes that was costing them money. And he was able to highlight that through his analysis and value analysis and so on, and wrote up about this, all the data. They were able to save in the region of 80 million a year by tweaking some of the handover processes, because every process owner was able to produce the data to say, look, I'm hitting my targets 98, 99% of the time, or close to 100. Everything is perfect coming in here and perfect going out, and so on. It was literally the downtime, the non-usable time. So for example, in the supply chain, if an order comes in, it's sitting on someone's desk over the weekend, that's wasted time. And then someone goes in and they have to go and drive to a place. So even down to that level of granularity, what are the non-productive elements of a process? And that's why we need to have the multidimensional, what are all these different perspectives? And then the economies of effort. Do we need, in the first instance, to measure to that level of granularity? Or can we just trap it? If it's easy to trap, we'll use it and assimilate it or combine it with other data, then we might have something meaningful. So you really have to look at how much effort is needed to generate the data and collect it, and how important or not that is to you. And that's why we talk about the economies of effort. How much time, effort does it take?
Are there infrastructural costs of, I suppose, gathering that much data in terms of servers and things like that to consider?
Absolutely. Now, some people say that memory is cheap, but it's not that relative to the effort that you could be putting in. I mean, even putting in a system and upgrading your system, to put in a server system into an organization to let's just say a small to medium sized company today is putting a mini version of SAP and so on. They still have to calculate the predictable growth and use of the system, so it's expandable, that they don't have to go and look for additional licenses in 6 weeks time or 6 months time, how much to future proof it. So that's why economy, so that takes in itself just an evaluation process on a big system like that is so important, but it's a huge effort. And similarly for a process, if you're getting people to come in, you're talking about training time, what you're going to measure, changing codes and so on. So even down to simple little bits of data, where do we fit this in? What reports? So when you already have a system, and even if you have to outsource, you've all heard of things like crystal reports. Companies will write these additional reporting searches and literally database scans and reports that come out, and they'll write the scripts for you and so on. And they charge money for them, but you would need to know, why do I need this? So it forces you to kind of think, is it really important or not to us? Or if it is important, is it worth the effort and so on? So, because essentially time is money and everything requires effort. So effort requires time, no matter what way. Even thinking and talking about it is time.
It's difficult to build a business case a lot of the time for some of these new technologies, isn't
it? Say again, Paul.
I find it's kind of sometimes it's difficult to build a business case for some of these new technologies.
Yes,
you put a dollar value on it, if you get me, for the company.
It is. It can be. That's why, for example, if you take IT people would love the new technology, and but do they see the cost implications for it? Because fundamentally, I would have been an IT background. Let me play with IT for till the cows come home and so on. I let finance worry about the money, let HR worry about the training and people and so on and so forth. That's where, as I said, I had to come out of the rabbit hole and start looking at, and in my own case, my background was in cost management accounting initially. So then I started to have an appreciation of, okay, it'd be great to have all Core i9 processors for everyone and GeForce graphics boards and so on, but they cost a freaking fortune. What's the benefit for it? Will an i5 do? Probably. I'm talking tech talk now in terms of processing power. So, putting those, having to be able to stand back. This is why, as in supply chain, we talk about trade-offs. So what do we want, and how much effort are we willing to, and how much can we future-proof the system? But putting a business case, I have another group of postgraduates where I do business development and project management as a combined type of subject, and it's all about building the business case and how you put the process methodologies, project management to deliver on that business case. And it's all about the planning up front, whether it's supply chain, looking at data systems for supply chain, looking at a continuous improvement program inside in a company, if it's introducing or upgrading your financial system, whatever it is, everything has to come down to a well-managed project. And the starting point of all of this is the planning up front. And we analyzed, as we would, back many years ago, the failures of projects. 80% of projects fail in the first phase, which is the planning phase. 80%. Years later, it started to come out in academic books and all that sort of stuff. This is what I was working with as I say, in the real world. But the academic books started to come out and say, oh yeah, all the planning started to latch onto that, and so on, so on, so on. But that's where the real, and it can be a drudgery. It can be a real pain in the ass trying to, at that stage, planning out the what if, and all the different scenarios, but absolutely necessary, because you put the effort in up front, then mostly everything else runs a lot more smoothly. You don't do that, it's a case of catch up, dodge, dive, duck bullets, dodge bullets, and so on for the rest. And as a project manager, you'll have many sleepless nights and so on, and you won't do it a second time, probably.
There is a balancing act, though, isn't there, Mark, kind of between having your plan and being too static and making sure it's still dynamic, and some of the measures that you've decided to take on board kind of evolve as you kind of get more information and more real-time data, where then you see, actually, we did do as best scenario planning and analysis as we could at the time, but now with this added information, this new measure makes sense. This old measure can kind of fall away because its importance isn't as important anymore.
Absolutely. And you know what they always say about planning?
Plan to fail.
Well, yeah, fail to plan, you plan to fail.
Yeah.
But the others,
if you that everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
in a manner of speaking, yeah. But generally, what happens is a plan within a very short period of time is out of date.
Yeah.
And
isn't that where your whole agile methodology comes into play then? Because you really avoid. I mean, I was involved in big scale projects many years ago. 2 years investment in projects that were out of date by the time that we came to the end of it. From a technology perspective. So I think agile methodology really allows you to mitigate better for things like that.
It does, and that has crept into project management.
It has
very effectively in the last, since around the mid 2000s, and in some cases has taken a lot of pressure off project managers insofar as that, again, what is agile? all you're doing is breaking it
Breaking
down
it
into
down.
small, manageable chunks.
In some ways, but in
Yeah.
other ways, you're in organizations that essentially still do their old archaic waterfall perspective and just
Yeah.
put a veneer of agile over the top. So I think you look at some of the management structures and they're so embedded in the old methodologies that they still want to see that kind of, when am I getting all the pieces? What do you mean this is happening? So it's good to see, but I don't think it's actually translatable in all of the companies yet. Younger
Well,
companies are much
that's
better.
more their outlook rather than anything
It's-
else, you know. So, you know, so if they're not true agile, then it's not agile, you know.
Well,
so
what's-
it's more their approach to it.
What's essentially happening is people jumping on the fad bandwagon
Yeah,
and
exactly.
like to throw out words.
That's it.
That's why I say that, you know, if you remember from my first lecture, I was saying that, remember, these are all concepts.
Yeah.
Lead time is a concept, agile is a concept, agile processes are concepts, and so on. And as concepts, you need to have a deeper understanding. Well, what does it actually mean?
Mhm.
And unfortunately, it supports the old adage, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. Too bloody right it is, you know, and unfortunately that's what happens.
Yeah.
And
Sometimes agility enables scope creep though as well.
It can do, Paul, yeah.
It and often does, but this is where, again, if you've ever looked at your earned value charts in your project management or in any project or process that you're implementing and so on, normally you'd have an S curve. It might be flat, but in any case, small effort start, then it ramps up and then it peels off towards the top. And because it's accumulated data, all accumulated data and trends will always show an S curve. Okay. Now, if you compare that the original baseline plan of this is what we wanted to implement, and this is the data we're collecting, and this is how much it's going to cost us, and this is the effort we're putting in on a per week, per activity, and you accumulate that, you'll always end up with this. It never ends up on that same line. It will go up, it'll come down, it'll go up and down, and oftentimes you have to replan maybe midways through because things happen that you have either missed or came totally as a shock to your system. Sometimes they're beneficial.
Like COVID.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, so how do we respond? It's how effectively and quickly we respond to these curveballs, as I like to call them. And that's what's important. And in some cases, this is why data does become important, because you can predict the risk element of certain activities and therefore try and mitigate those risks before they possibly happen or not. Sometimes, as I said, things can happen outside your control, and that's why having a multidimensional perspective of what's happening, talking to other parts of the organization to get an understanding. And someone might pass a simple comment, did you hear about such and such a company down the road, and say, holy Jesus, that affects us inside here. That's why, as I say, knowledge is power. Sharing it is even more powerful, because sometimes you might not even understand yourself the impact of something that you heard, saw or read somewhere that can benefit someone else either positively or negatively. And that's why, you know, sharing it all out, blah, blah, blah.
Just getting back to some of your previous comments, Mark, about, and maybe referring to Paul's as well, without that investment in, if you like, in tools, systems, you know, to measure metrics, to measure indicators, then you may not have that ability to sort of gain a competitive advantage. And examples I'm thinking of, you know, would be the likes of Motorola or Toyota. You know, without being able to measure where inefficiencies are, where, you know, defects and you know, quality breakdowns occur, then you can't target them, which means you can't improve, you can't differentiate, and that's kind of, you know, feeds into the ROI of investing in systems, tools, and big data potentially, you know, to measure those indicators, to measure those performance components, those attributes.
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes a product could be performing quite satisfactorily, and then maybe years later or months later something is going wrong. Then you can go back into the data and say, could we have identified this? Was data there that could have given us an indicator of, or a new metric, or not a new index that we could have used in this case? And that's what we call, that constant refining and reusing. And that's why in when I'm teaching project management, I say you always go back over your previous process. What did we do? Could we have done it differently? How could we improve on what we've already done? And in actual fact, I have it down to 2 sentences. What did we do previously? And how can we improve on the way we did what we did previously? Those 2 sentences are reflective practice, continuous improvement. All of these are embedded in that sentence. I don't know if you've been doing reflective practice or anything, these reports. I used to do it with these modules, but I don't anymore. I don't have the time for that. But it's in other areas, it's absolutely critical. The point is, you need to evaluate. That's why, for example, in management terms, and particularly in quality, jumping up and down, say, yeah, we got it right. We've hit our over 95% of our targets, and everything is great. Yippee, let's go down to the pub and have a few jars, kind of thing. But if you only hit 85% and your target was 95, skin and hair starts to fly, and the fingering and the blame pointing and all that, finger pointing and blaming, and the sacrificial lambs and all this mentality kicks in, and so on. So there's all hell and breaks loose. If we were putting the same effort in trying to find the scapegoat or and so on, for the blame game, if we're putting the same effort in to finding out why or how we got it so right, over 95%, it would be far better organizations. Now, many organizations are that way anyway. And this is what we even measure that in terms of the maturity of an organization, the maturity of its leadership, and so on. And they're at various levels and scales right across all the different industries. But the fundamentals are, equally as something goes wrong, it's as important to understand and review the data, why stuff went right. Why? Because that's how you continuously improve. If we know why we got it right or how we got it right, can we repeat it? It's all about repeatability in these things. And
sometimes that comes down to the conflict between operations and, let's say, they're thinking on a daily or weekly basis, and I suppose other parts of the company, like the strategic end of the company, thinking in the 5-year, the 2-year terms,
Yeah, exactly. And the problem with that is that that's why, like your strategic goals, if you say, for argument's sake, you want to have over the next 3 years a 4.5% increase in delivery quality, or you want to improve your market share by 9%, and you want to reduce costs by 7%, and so these are high level objectives, goals at strategic level, so to speak. They have to be calculated down. So in terms of the reduction of cost and the improvement of delivery times, those 2 elements could directly affect operations. Maybe not all of the cost savings could be in there. It would be how to say, almost a given that most of it would be in operations, but it could be in other parts of the organization. That's why the linkages between the data right up to the strategic objectives are extremely important, and having the right systems in place there. And some companies, like, again, the Toyotas, they have their dashboards and so on, and many others nowadays anyway have their dashboards, so you can see if you're contributing and how much you're contributing, and ahead or behind in contributing towards the overall strategic goals, broken down to a weekly or monthly basis. That's why it's important to see that linkage. And even on the human side of it, it shows that, yes, we're as a team and a process group and so on, and you as an individual, you're contributing. And that's why we often tie in performance and appraisal systems and so on into these overall arching objectives. But let us move on, because and that kind of covers the last point there. When it facilitates trust, so people can see the numbers, they can see what's happening, and they'll actually trust the data that's coming out based on the process and so on. And as I said, never blame people, blame the process. Now, some people might say, well, you do have some dodgy characters in places. Yeah, you will. You'll have a couple of flakes here and there. It goes without saying. But generally speaking, it's usually the process. Maybe they're too advanced for the person. Maybe and how you mitigate that, you train them and so on, or you change the process, or you talk to the people about the processes. Most important, talk to those that are actually using the current processes. What do you think, Mark, of making a change here? Could we improve this? I've noticed you've been hitting your targets consistently over the last number of weeks on this production line, and you're about 4 or 5% ahead of target. Are there some improvements? What are you doing that's consistently up there? Can we improve the process without, of course, taking away my bonuses and so on, because I've hit above my target and now stretching the bar or raising the bar that I can't hit the bonus levels anymore? But asking them and working, again, that's down to the leadership and process evaluation and so on. But that's how you start to build the trust. So people take ownership of the processes and consequently the data that's being produced of those processes or the systems themselves. So I'm going to fly through this thing, but it just shows the evolution of raising the bar in terms of performance. And we go straight to the 2000s. You know, we have logistics performance standards that we've had in place. The customers themselves much higher expectations, more bang for their buck, and so on. Of course, technology, we've covered that so many times, and the availability and the cheapness, generally speaking, of technology insofar as it's no longer cost prohibitive. I mean, SAP was one company that, instead of buying their high-end, gold standard system for an SME would have been, not practical. They reduced, they came out mini SAP and so on. So they saw not so much that there was another market for it, but these smaller organizations could also benefit from the slimmed down version of it, as opposed to a big multinational version using it, on steroids and so on. But much of the same technology, so it trickles down. So everyone's a winner then, but it means you have to train staff to use this. So nevertheless, you have the technology there, shareholders, suppliers, and of course, the whole concept of enterprise resource planning in the first instance. And as we all know, I mean, I would have been back in the 80s, definitely, when we were using a DEC PDP-11 computer to run part of our production process above up in Ericsson. And this was a machine that had like piano keys on it, the pinks and purples and things like that. That will tell you how far back we were looking. And a simple system, Frey, Loki, and Thor, as you would probably know the movies and God, but Norse gods, and they were the debtors, creditors, and nominal ledgers. And they were the very first systems, and there was only a handful of people could actually use those things and using Apple computers. So we came through all of that, and going back, and it's fascinating to see how the systems, but always started inside in manufacturing or operations, and then permeated out into other parts of the organization eventually. And that's why we now have these integrated systems, such as SAP. SAP has over 80% of the world market in ERP systems. The rest will be made up maybe of Sybase and what's the other one? Oracle. They would have a small part of the market, but yes, well over 80, probably closer to 90% of the market run from SAP itself.
Is there a piece, Mark, that as it's kind of gone through the years, there's been dedicated supply chain logistics companies that are outsourced now, and that's their main focus of their business, is to get that element. So if you look at the rise in consolidation over the last number of years, there's big distribution companies that really focus and hone in on the data they have and what they do, and they're doing it across industries and all of that.
If I'm understanding your question, the specialization in transportation.
Yeah, well, if you look at that, that's taken into account, the different elements over a number of years. One element is that supply chain function in some companies is outsourced to a specialized company that take care of it.
Absolutely, the majority of companies have gone that way, outsourcing that, because again, the technology has become so advanced, it wouldn't be practical. I mentioned previously that, stick to doing what you're good at, what your core competencies are. I mean, that's part of a strategic process analysis, and, find out. So if you're good at manufacturing stents, you don't need to be worrying about transportation systems. Get somebody else to do that. That's why collaborations, partnerships, and outsourcing and developing these and making sure that you can have these seamless functions working together as a whole from a customer's perspective. So in other words, that the transportation system, their systems are really, really perfect. They're fascinating technologies alone, and they cost money, and that's what you're paying for, such that the end goal is getting the product to the customer as soon as possible at the right quality, right price, blah, 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 and all this sort of stuff. So yes, it makes absolute perfect sense to outsource to such companies, and that's why they've evolved. Even though it looks as though they're all going off in different, you might have freight handlers they'll have a whole system as well, tracking stuff across the globe, for example. Then you have the transportation system. Sometimes this is what brings us in, and we will be covering later on, third party and fourth party logistics service providers. And so we will be kind of coming full circle to bring these all back in together again as such. Folks, it's 12 o'clock. Can we take, I'll say, maximum 10 minutes?
Perfect.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
Thanks,
yeah, we're spot on at 12 o'clock. Yeah, so 10 past 12, and we'll reconvene in the room.
Cheers, Mark.
Right,
Thanks.
See you then.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
On this particular slide, so just what did I want to say on this? A quick story before I move on, to show the importance of multi-dimensional looks, even though it's very basic. Back in 1979, 1980, I was an assistant accountant in the costing management department down in Clover Meats. Doesn't exist as such now, but back then. So one of my tasks was to categorize the weight of cattle that were being processed. And on this, and so I got a printout from the IT department in pajama paper, as you might remember, possibly not, but that thick, and I'm not joking, and it's thumbed through this, and with a calculator, with a little roll on it, calculate out these various subcategories of cattle, until on one particular category, the numbers were slightly askew. It didn't fit the trend indices, the trends that I had in previous weeks. And I spent about 2 hours going back over my calculations, and I gave up the ghost, tail between the legs, went into the divisional accountant, and Michael was his name. I said, Michael, I said, there's something, I don't know what it is. I can't figure out what's happening here in the categories. And he looked down to my analysis and he said, okay, I see where your problem is here. And I said, yeah, I said, this particular category or group, the data is wrong. Or I said, it's not working out. It doesn't trend. And asked me immediately, bring me in the printouts, brought him in the printouts, and he scanned down to it and said, there it is there. And I looked at it and said, what? He said, 999,800 something or other. He said, or it was 009, blah, blah, blah. So he told me to calculate the IBM program could only count up to 999,999. And my actual figure said, put a 1 in front of that and put the figures in. And I did. And lo and behold, bang, everything trended correctly. So this is why understanding the data, but it also brings in this as a part of the multidimensional perspective, is having an understanding of the numbers and the trends and so on. And let's call it gut feeling or what you want. That was 1979, 1980. I remember the day, the instance, because it had a huge effect on me. It gave me an education to understand that, to trust the numbers, you need to understand, and sometimes the input data can be wrong, and you can go back and check it. That's the whole point, that you understand the numbers, trust in the numbers, that you can go back and say, well, something went wrong here, or something was input incorrectly. Roll ahead to one of the examples you have in the Otto case study, where they talk about AI, and one of the companies, another company, using artificial intelligence to try and recategorize stock where their barcodes or their RFID technology has been corrupt by electromagnetic distortion or impact from the motors for opening doors in close proximity to where these products were stacked under shelves and so on. That's how far advanced we have come. Now, folks, I'm going to have to move at pace on this. Now, most of the groundwork is put in here. So you can see back here, if you go back to the 60s and 70s and partly into the 80s, we worked in a push system and much further back than the 60s as well. So in other words, companies built stuff, put it out there, and customers were expected to buy it or not. That was the case. Now, why this has become so important and why the data has become so important is that we're in a pull system and have been for the last close on 20 odd years. It's been ramping up and ramping up. And a pull system is we have to be highly responsive to customers. And that's highlighted in the bottom part of it here, as you can see, supply chain and customer service costs. In other words, giving the customer what they want, when they want it, at an affordable price, and so on. Whatever we have to do, that's why it's so important to take the BMW, dynamic efficiency, small increments, small improvements in different parts of the system across the whole supply chain enables us to be more responsive to customers and fulfill the pull system, meeting the demand precisely when it's needed and so on, reducing waste and so on and so on. Sounds almost unachievable. It's the holy grail, but we always strive to get to that level. So that's why this chronological graph and showing of the systems is important. Just something. Okay. Now, flying quickly through these again, is a result, getting these metrics, supply chain metrics in place, and the successful development is a team effort, and this is why we talk about multi-dimensions, multi-functions, different functions, including in many cases bringing in your suppliers and your distributors and so on, transportation, so whomever, anything that's outsourced, bring them all in, make it a team. What can we all do as a collective to reduce our costs and so on and so on. Customers and suppliers, as I just mentioned, and a tiered structure, having the cascading effect of these are, and sometimes it may even be worthwhile trying to align the strategic objectives of the outsourced company with your company, so that there's some kind of handover of dovetailing in processes such that overall we're all winners. That's why this ultimate goal of absolute collaboration and partnership in supply chain management, it becomes so important in terms of the shared responsibilities or the shared efforts to be able to get the products to the customers more efficiently. Metric owners, obviously someone that always has to put a name to it, so that the direct person you can go to make an improvement or otherwise, division and performance. Establish procedures to mitigate conflicts inside in your organizations, and indeed with external organizations. We briefly touched on SLAs and so on and so forth, and force majeure and so on. And I said, oftentimes the practical solution, avoiding the lawyers and the litigations and all that sort of stuff, is say, right, this is where we are, this is the mess we're in, what can we do to improve it, what can we do to get around it, how do we manage our way out of this situation as a group, rather than getting into a conflict mode. Oftentimes that's all it takes to reduce the conflict, because fundamentally what was that oh geez, what was the Sex Pistols song? Isn't something like bad energy or is a waste of emotion or something like that. I can't remember exactly the words of the song, around my time. Consistent with corporate strategy, point I already made. Corporate strategy, goals, objectives, cascade them down and establish top management support. So it goes without saying that this is clearly articulated, communicated always down through the various levels of an organization, down as possible to individual level, so that everyone can see the connectivity and their input into each of these, and ownership for their processes and data. And ultimately, that's where you get buy-in. That's the whole HR side of things in terms of motivation and so on. So let's move quickly on to performance categories, process measurement categories, score levels, the supply chain operational methodologies and metrics, and then logistics quantification pyramid. Time, quality, cost, and other supporting, as I say. Now, interesting, time, quality, and cost are three of the overall generic performance objectives, which I'll be coming on to, I think, in the next lecture, or give or take, yeah. but on-time delivery, you can read these for yourselves at your own time, but they're pretty self-explanatory. You know, the quality, for example, you know, the perfect order fulfillment, on-time delivery, complete order, accurate product, getting and so on, accurate invoicing. All of these criteria you can use to measure what is the perfect order. But most importantly, get the data from the customers as well. What do they think is the perfect order? You know, time of day it's been delivered, and the flexibility of when it's been delivered to the customer and so on. And then you'll have all different customers. They'll all have an opinion, unfortunately. Then we have to start categorizing their opinions. Well, what matters most to different types of, what matters most to business customers compared to individual private customers, blah, 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 all these, and then trying to service it. It's exactly one of the exercises I'm doing with another company is customer segmentation, in terms of the level of service they're providing to different customers in different geographic locations and so on. And with that, I'll build a predictability tool to say, well, if somebody from the far east in the country wants to buy the service, is it worth our effort to even engage with that customer or refer it to somebody else more local and so on? And only when we have the benchmarking done and the data done and the customer feedback and segmentation done can we even attempt to predict the profitability of encountering or dealing with such a customer. And it may not all come down to money. It may be a decision that, yes, we'll take on that customer up in the Far East. It's outside our geographic region. We might have to hire somebody. However, it might be a good step to opening up that part of the market because there's potentials down here. So you can see how sometimes a decision based on numbers might not just look favorable, but we have to look at it. What are the other possibilities? And then make a decision. And that's why having good teamwork and good input from multiple perspectives, multi-dimensional approach can impact on the decision or not. And then we have, of course, the cost to serve the customer, cash to cash cycle, the holy grail of business, your cash flow or your working capital cycle, how quickly you can get the money in and how often and when you pay suppliers, and then cover all your costs. And then other supporting things, approval to exceptions to standards, minimum order quantity, change order timing, and availability of information. And that's one of the issues that was raised in the auto case study, where people were buying stuff, ordering it online, and then walking down the street, say, oh, there it is there, I want it now. So I'll go in and buy the shop and cancel the order. So it was costing auto a small fortune in the returns because they had to cover the cost. The customer couldn't be expected to pay for the returns of stuff, and so on. The year before last, I had an issue when I bought something on Amazon through PayPal, and the product came to me was defective, and they had a replacement item in the post to me before I had even sent back the original one. And I actually had it 2 days later. They even sent me an email with an attachment that I could just literally cut off the address and barcode and stick it onto the envelope, put that into the post and send back free of charge and so on. And so, wow, that was phenomenal customer service. The product was, once I had legitimized the reason for why this happened, there wasn't even a question asked, bang, out the door with a replacement. That's quality of service, and you'll see that in our it's on Moodle. I have things there called ServQual, and that's important. Understanding and gathering data from your customers, what pleases the customers, and you find those pleasure points, and then you can actually start building your metrics to deliver on those and so on. And again, as I said, they'll be dynamic, they'll change with customers' whims, fads, likes, dislikes, and so on. And we have to be responsive, agile, or flexible enough to be able to do that. And only when you have the data and the knowledge, the data built up into the knowledge, can you actually then make decisions more effectively. Now, this is just a score framework.
Mark,
yeah.
Sorry, can I ask a question there? What do you think of the Net Promoter Score for customer service? Good or bad, or misses the point? Or
Net Promoter Score?
Yeah, do you've come across that? It's like kind of based on how likely are you to recommend us for future business?
It's like the TripAdvisor and all that, pulling in all that sort of data
Yeah,
in
sort
another
of, yeah.
guise.
Yeah.
Again, if show me the numbers. How many customers have we got through referrals and so on, and how much effort is it costing to put those systems in place? Do you know that we had this with employees? If you recommend an employee, you got €1,000 or a bonus and so on, so forth, to come in. So it's that was worthwhile, for example. So you stuck your neck out for your best friend, and then you threaten them down the pub if you don't deliver. It's my reputation. But so again, it has to back to one of the previous points. Evaluate. Is it effective? And how valuable is it or not to your organization? And how often? If it's only accounting, we say for less than 1%, maybe it's so insignificant. But no harm in keeping an eye on it, because you might have, you might identify something that some issue around the what do you call it? The promoter. Are there agendas in there? Are they on commission? This is why, for example, I follow a lot of stuff. Specific stuff on YouTube, and what I have noticed is that they always upfront have a disclaimer or not, or this has been sponsored by such and such, but my opinions are biased. In other words, these kind of influencers as well. So you have a lot of that crossover. But again, would you take them I don't. I'll do further and further research. It's the same if you're going to buy a product online, you'll do more and more data and more searches until you're happy that it's worthwhile. And then you say, well, that was a lot of effort to go into that. But if it was for something small, an insignificant piece of equipment, €20, of course, then I'm not going to spend so much time and say, yeah, that's, I can suffer that less. But if it was €2,000, of course, I'll put in a lot more effort. So it's all proportional as well. In other words, the economies of effort on that. So just moving on, folks, I'm not even halfway through yet. Here you have this score model. Again, it's just another way of showing how you put the high level metrics in place and then cascade them down into sub levels. So it's a nice handy model or framework to help you show the linkages between various metrics within your supply chain specifically, and then you can link those with a bit of work into your overall strategic metrics. So here, if you look at the attributes of the level 1 metrics, now I really want to move quickly through here. Supply chain reliability, so the problems of supply chain, delivering correct product to correct customers, the R's, as we call them, right product, right place at the right time, right quality, and the right address, and so on. And then that's a level 1 metric. So the delivery performance, the fill rates, this is what we might measure, and we might have 3 or 4 different metrics that we look at inside and to show how reliable or not our system is. We might look for other ones, might look at some of the, we might link with a transportation companies outsourced score model and say, well, we can add in a 4th dimension here, the speed of delivery, for example, and so on. So what metrics are they pulling together to show? Remember this point I made about the downtime between processes. How long is it sitting in our warehouse before it's picked up, and how long is it sitting inside in the wholesalers before it's picked up and distributed? So we might measure those as well with forward and backward integration or partnerships. So going down through all those costs, these are the metrics at level 1 that gives us the high level or the attribute of what we're trying to achieve. Supply chain costs, cost of goods sold. That's a quagmire. Everything is buried in the cost of goods unless it's coded correctly and so on in your systems, that you can actually trace all relative costs to a particular product. So it gives us an idea of the supply chain, and you would need that level of data to be able to segment the customers, so as you know that these customers are highly profitable because these are the cost of sales that we're able to attribute to those particular customers in that group on these particular product levels. And again, because the systems are there, we can post-process the data and create metadata to say, focus on these guys. And it could be a case that some of these customers can be a right pain in the ass altogether to deal with. But nevertheless, filling all these criteria, say, yeah, but we're making good money off it. We can take the abuse of phone calls, the odd time as such, just because our data shows that this is worth our while organizationally and so on. And sometimes when I said, these customers are just too demanding, not worth all the effort, and they're too difficult to deal with. Get rid of them. They're taking up too much of our time and so on, and always complaining and so on. So cut them out like a cancer and focus more, and that can impact on the morale and the behavior inside your own organization, making those type of decisions. So you see what I mean? There's so many other things that have to come into play. Can you measure all those? Of course you can measure customer satisfaction and feedback, and listen to your people taking orders and so on and so forth. And even simple conversations can be telling you it doesn't actually have to be trapped. And you might notice that there's a trend in particular customers' behaviors and so on, and say, well, this is out, and it might indicate that they could be under pressure, they could be bad, it could be any one of a dozen reasons, and before you actually take out the surgical knife. And then supply chain asset management efficiency, again, looking internally at your processes and externally, the partners that you're working at, and say, what can we do to improve our turnaround times at all stages or at all processes, and how can we reduce the inter-process times, all ultimately aimed at reducing the overall order delivery time, customer order to customer delivery, all of those little things that happen inside there. What can we do to change any of those to shorten that time? And then, of course, the attributes: reliability, responsiveness, agility, all cost, and asset management. So we've covered all of these here, but they begin to merge or emerge in some of the finances now very shortly. But again, look, for example, if you look at agility, upside supply chain flexibility, upside supply chain adaptability, so how we can actually respond to the customers and how quickly and efficiently we do it. That's the agility concept being applied to what we're already doing, and then improve that, continuous improvement programs, the Lean Six Sigma and so on, all coming from this, from slightly different perspectives to produce the same end results, better quality of service to meet all customers' demands and needs, and then overall value at risk in terms of the effort that you're putting in. And then the cost to serve, which we talked about previously, and asset manage, cash flow cycle, return on supply chain fixed assets, and return on capital, working capital. Straight away, you're into the finance side of it: cash cycle, return on fixed assets, and return on working capital, the working capital cycle. This is how we evaluate the asset management, the physical assets inside in our organization. This then just is, as I say, the quantification pyramid. So transaction costs and revenue. We have logistics service, operations and logistics here, and then channel satisfaction. This is another way of representing what I'm talking about when we talk about channel satisfaction and having all of these. Of course, the ultimate goal is to satisfy the customers. That's channel satisfaction. The different channels, whether it is online, retail stores, wholesales, direct orders, click and collect, all of these different, or you physically go in and put them in stores and people buy them. All the different ways of getting your product to the customer. Behind each of those channels are all of these different supply chain and logistics structures. Doesn't mean you have to, if it's going to be click and collect, you have to invest in more real estate to have a section of your building or an additional building where people can drive in and conveniently and collect their products. What if some bloke drives up in a smart car and he wants to bring home a fridge freezer, for crying out loud? They do. Just go up to IKEA any weekend and just watch people trying to stuff things into, oh, Jesus Christ, beggars belief. And then having to go back inside, sorry, this won't fit my car, can you now actually deliver it, or can arrange to have it collected and so on and so forth, and having those facilities. And IKEA are pretty good at that kind of stuff and so on. They'll charge you, nevertheless, it's for the service. But in any case, you have all these different possibilities, flexibility to deliver to the different customers and different customers' requirements and so on. All of these other parts of the transactions are, if you take the transaction cost and revenue, if you take that example of IKEA there, the transaction costs, yeah, we can deliver, but it's going to cost you money, and it'll have to be done between this time and that time and so on, generally speaking. So that's a cost to a service. And that's why they're able to predict it. And then they have the different geographic locations. If you're in 30 kilometers or whatever it is, 50 kilometers, there's a price range. You're down in Cork, tough luck, you're going to pay over well over the counter for the cost of having something delivered down there, plus the cost of the trip that you went up in the first place to look at it and so on. So another channel to market might be your online and virtual and so on. So putting those assets in place so somebody can come in and do the virtual shopping and then order and so on and so forth. How realistic you want to make it, that costs money. Nevertheless, it's a channel to the customer to enable them to make a purchasing decision, and then you charge them for the delivery of that. And sometimes that you might have factored in some of the cost of putting that system in place to be able to recover it through the delivery costs and so on and so forth. So supply chain finance connection. So if you look at it, the cost of providing logistics service not only affects the marketability of the product via the landed cost or price, but also its impact on profitability. That's the name of the game. How effectively can we do what we're already doing and improve them? So inventory management and capital. We have so much money in the organization. Accountants love to see inventory inside there. Why? Because they can sell it and make money back. Not a good idea. It's any operations manager or any organizer, we don't want stock. It costs us money because you have all the non-productive costs, and somehow they go into cost of sales and they have to be accounted for. Lighthouses, warehousing, light, heat, insurance, staffing, technology, and so on and so forth. If you have to have warehouses on your premises and so on. So the ideal situation, if you can have it like a pipeline, take it out of the ground and pipe it directly to or close to the petrol pump. If you can get to that flow, or producing any of these liquid production industries, if you can get to that level, then everything can be done more and more seamlessly. So there's no stop, start. That's where you can get inventory management and reduce your capital costs ultimately.
How does someone like Amazon manage that? You know, where they've got such a breadth and depth of products and suppliers, etc. Like, how do they manage that versus someone who's a little bit more contained?
They have to operate that kind of a model because of the diversity of all the different products that they're offering. If you notice, Dell wouldn't have that type of structure, right? Because they're very specific, so they can be more effective. So what the likes of Amazon are putting in place, their suppliers are also on their data is able to indicate what kind of products are shifting and selling and the frequency and so on. So that's extremely powerful going back to the suppliers, so they can actually keep their fulfillment centers at the right levels of stock, because ultimately what Amazon trades on is not only the variety, but also the speed at which they can get it to you, and that's why they're able to give the predictability. And they will tell you straight up, we're out of stock. We'll let you know, give us an email notification. So they have those mechanisms in place to funnel stuff in there and then get it out. And it's a one-stop shop from a customer's perspective. So you can find almost anything you want on site in Amazon rather than having to trawl through multiple other sites. And that's how they've built their business model. And that's why Jeff Bezos is able to retire this year. God love him.
Wouldn't it also, when you take ownership of the inventory? So I doubt Amazon take ownership of the inventory until they sell it to you. So Amazon, it's not showing on Amazon's balance sheet. I would say
no, and definitely not, because fundamentally Amazon are just providing a service.
So it shows on the suppliers. It's when you take ownership of the inventory, I would say that's the big push these days, isn't it?
It is indeed, and again, you can if you're in specialist areas, if you were ordering a yacht from Italy, which I wouldn't have no idea about, but if you were, do you take ownership from when it leaves the gate of the manufacturing or the shipbuilders, or does the transportation company take ownership of it, or do you take ownership when it arrives on the Shannon for you, or down in the west somewhere on the sea? And they're all issues that generally are trashed out, and particularly when it comes to the insurance in transport insurance. So now that's really exceptional size of things, or high-end sort of stuff. But ultimately, who's providing the service, who owns the product, and you have all of these ICO terms. I think there's one of the that comes up later on, and one I have a list of, when you actually take ownership, and depending on the agreements that you would have had in place with your suppliers and your forwarders and so on, so when you actually take ownership of the actual product, whether it's when it comes into the country in the container, at that point in your country is you have ownership, or do you take ownership and responsibility? Therefore, you have to ensure it when it leaves the Far East somewhere. So, but we can come back to those. I'll have a dig out and see if I have that. I'm pretty sure it comes up later on in one of the lectures. So order processing time in order to cycle the cash, again getting your money out, and one of the again the direct sales model, for example, and making it easy channels to customers. The number of companies now that are financing. Well, we've had it in the car industry. Now I'm seeing it in the bike industry. German company for Canyon, they'll hit your credit card for 6,000 euros, but they won't take it all out. They can split it over 6 months, for example. But I looked at that, and the company they're using is called Splitit, or Split IT. I call it Splitit. But and I said, and it says 0% interest and no credit check and all this. And I said, okay, why? And the penny dropped. Of course, if you have a credit card, the risk is with the credit card company, not with the Splitit, because if you have a sufficient fund or limit in your account, they see this as valid enough. But it opens up another channel, another customer segment to offer their products to increase their offering. And what was driving that? And I said, well, why would they change their model? Why would they introduce this kind of easy payment option? Of course, customers were looking for it. They, coming up with $6,000 cash for a bloody bike is no mean achievement. But if you can spread it out, it takes the sting out of it and so on and so forth. And customers feel they're not being hit for such a high price, even though they're still below kind of market level using the Dell model, direct sales. But more importantly, what's driving this was it's completing negotiations with fund managers to take it over. Why? Because they see a huge profitability in that type of model, and the way the profits. I mean, do you think it costs 6,000 to make a bike? Absolutely freaking not. A couple of $100 down in Taiwan. And even the German bikes are made down in this case in Taiwan, and shipped back, and then put on a few components and bang out the door. And so there is serious profit on all of these products. That's why investment funds are getting in, and it's a kind of an area that I'd be worried about, because these investment funds and fund managers are beginning to look at all of these other product areas, and they will destroy it. It's pure greed and pure hunger. Finding case GameStop, have a look and see what happened there. Moving quickly on, transform reductions in equivalent revenues, as we call it. So profit clearly is revenue minus costs. So we look at the costs, where X percentage of revenue, your cost of sales, and then profit, and so on. So basic. So we're able to calculate our margin and sales margin. So we want to be able to drive up our profit. So inside in all of this, what we're trying to find is our costs. How can we reduce our costs, and possibly increase our revenues and reduce our possibly take down our profit margin? Why would that be? Why would you want to do that? Market share. You'd probably want to reduce to compete more effectively against others. So one of the ways you can bring down your profit margin is if you're able to bring down your costs, not necessarily at the same rate, but if you can accelerate your cost reductions, then your profitability goes up, even though your revenues might be remaining the same or ever so slightly increasing. The whole idea is to widen the gap between costs and revenue. So and these are just working out. So because I'm pressing against time, I'm not going through it, but have a look at these, and you can see how, for example, the different areas percentage. Sales equivalent for cost savings, sales, total costs, and then net profit. Now, this is the start of what I was describing to you the other night on a very powerful piece of I'll call it technology, concept, model, methodology, DuPont pyramid analysis. And this is your pyramid on the side, and the next few graphs are this kind of thing. But as you can see, revenue minus costs equals profit. Then inventory plus accounts receivable plus cash plus fixed assets gives you the capital employed. One divided by the other gives you your return on assets. So there are several key metrics inside in finance: return on assets, return on investment, earnings per share, and share dividend. But more importantly, earnings per share. When you put all these indices together, gives you an indication of the performance of the company, not just financially, but the use of its assets, and that's what shareholders and analysts look. So only about a half dozen of these high-end ratios in finance that all the analysts use, and then they delve down more into it. And you can see this coming up here now. So if you look at cash receivables, order cycle time, that can affect your receivables, invoice accuracy. So if you have the wrong unit price, you're not going to get paid because and so on and so on. So you have to be spot on, and getting dates wrong can also be an issue for companies. And the old trick we used to use many years ago was, shouldn't be saying this. We'd get invoices in from suppliers, and they, 30 or odd days would have elapsed, and they'd ring up, have you processed that invoice? And say, oh geez, no, we didn't receive. What invoice was that? I'm like, could you send it out again? So we'd be kind of trying to negotiate an additional 30 days as such through send us out a copy. That was in the good old days of paper. That's it. So I'm just going to go off screen while I'm trying to fix this and talk at the same time. So cash receivables, inventory, and service levels of stockouts. The absolute disaster in any organization, of course, is a stockout, and that's the last thing you want to have, because the propensity to lose customers permanently is greatly increased if you have a stockout. Why? Because of competition. Customers may take other products and say simply, no, you let me down. I've gone now from Weetabix to Kellogg's cornflakes, and I actually might like those, and I'll never come back to them again, kind of thing. Simple as it may sound, but that's the reality of how things can go pear-shaped for you as a supplier. Plant property, distribution facilities, transportation equipment, which we kind of mentioned earlier on. So why invest? So if you can reduce your costs by outsourcing to specialist companies. Now, some people might say, yeah, but wouldn't that cost you more? Not necessarily, because of their efficiencies, they can do things far more efficiently than you could have possibly dreamed of. Therefore, you're ultimately going to save money. And again, if these companies are seeing that you have that they're going to have a longer term partnership with you, then inevitably they'll work with you to start reducing their costs. Where am I now here on this? Debt equity, that's another lovely ratio altogether. Financing options for inventory and warehouses. So how much money you actually have to borrow to put all these facilities and mechanisms in place, or do you dip into your own cash reserves? Because even if you dip into your own cash reserves, is that a wise thing to do? Oftentimes it's not, and the simple reason is that it could be far easier, far more cost effective financially to borrow from a bank or shareholders increase, rather than using your cash reserves, because you might have more important projects potentially coming up down the road that will use your money. Remember, an organization has only a set slice of cake that they can distribute, and right now money is cheap technically. So borrow. Danny DeVito's, other people's money. So financing, and you may not have the money. You may have to go and raise funds to introduce a new production process, or introduce new products, or expand, or go into a new market, and so on and so forth. These all cost money, and the debt equity ratio, in other words, you're gearing, you're leveraging. How much money are you up to your neck in finance? And investors will look at this in terms of they're highly debt leverage, which means that they're Aer Lingus many years ago, when it was coming up for sale, why do you think Ryanair wanted to buy it? Was it because of Aer Lingus and name, and because Michael O'Leary had an ego? Absolutely not. I have great respect for the man. the pension reserves were phenomenal. Huge money against which the company could borrow and improve their production and improve their services and so on. That's why the companies, external companies, were particularly interested in buying Aer Lingus back then, and so on and so on. So the financial implications of supply chain strategies. How am I doing on time? It's oh yeah, we're only we're getting. Again, channel structure management, customer segmentation, and the channels you're using to serve those customers. So use outsourcing, transportation, freight forwarders. We'll be coming onto all of this in third and fourth party logistics service providers down the road. Minimize the channel inventories, so how much stock you have going to each of the channels, how much you have to hold on hand to deliver to customers, or how much your retailers and the wholesalers need, and so on, having the right levels going into the different channels, all in the ultimate goal of to avoid stockouts. Particularly in mass consumer goods, you have a stock out, you're going to be in trouble, potentially. And the cost of that, of a stock out, in terms of lost future revenues and the cost of additional marketing to win those customers back again, blitz campaigns and so on for marketing. So you see how a simple thing as a stock out can have serious knock-on effects down the road. And if people go, and as I said, word of mouth, people say, oh, I used to buy this product for, now I went to this product. And so word of mouth, more customers lost because they let us down. They didn't have it when we needed it and all this sort of stuff. It's as simple as that. You satisfy the customers, meet demand, or else you'll end up paying for it. So efficient channel structures, again, that's how, very simply, the mechanisms you have in place to make it and fine-tune it, whether you have a direct sales, if do you put all your efforts into that and ignore your other channels? Of course not. So it has to be proportionate. That's why you need to go back to the data. Which of our channels are when we segment it across our different customers, which are the more profitable, which are least profitable, and how can we improve those least profitable ones? Look at the channel structure itself and the supply chain behind that particular channel. And then where can we make improvements? Can we collaborate with our different transportation systems? I keep picking on transportation, but it's easy. You might have a transportation company dedicated to your direct sales, online sales, and someone else for retail and wholesale outlets as such. Is there some way of merging? Maybe are they both as efficient as one another in terms of getting the products from your place to the points of destination? Where can you improve all of these? Again, efficiencies amongst each of the different channels. All of these, when you pull all these together, so there are only so many of the elements that you will have the direct data for within your own company to be able to calculate the return on the assets. But as you begin to look at these partnerships, agreements, and so on and so forth, then you can start looking at a higher level of return on assets, not just within your own company. And some of the finance or the accountants are begin to kind of take issue with that, because we would say we're part of a bigger chain. So the return on assets on the chain involving suppliers and customers is one measure in terms of measuring the efficiency of the supply chain management versus the return on assets just within your own company. And maybe yours is lower and the overall one is a higher return. Therefore, if the higher return, what can we do to come in line with the overall? So you can see how the thinking is beginning to evolve in these areas as such. So it's not just about the me. Look at the bigger picture and involve all the organizations and see how we can now as a collective become far more efficient. And one of the metrics, return asset. So improving delivery time, transportation management, order management, inventory management, and channel structure. So they're the four generic or key areas that at a higher level that you can start to break down into these other levels of category. Eliminate obsolete excess items, for example. How do you do that? You might have a sale, get rid of them, 2 for 1, bargain, and so on. Why? Because it's probably costing you money to have them in stock. Get rid of them. Keep the stuff moving all the time. And here's just an example, a worked example. Now, after lecture, you knock yourselves out and go down to the calculation, but it shows where a 10% reduction. Look at down there and how you can make a savings across. So the profit margins, and you can see in terms of profit margin, for example, in cost, transportation reduction cost has a 7.24% impact on profit margin, and so on. So you look at all of these return on assets. So which one do we want to focus on? Inventory turns per year, 888. Pretty much standard across the board, except for reduced by 10%. It gives 8.89. Is that important? In other words, how quickly, an indicator of how quickly you're turning around stock and getting it out, might be important to you, but might not be important to the customer. So let's not focus on that one. Let's go back to transportation, or we look at the what other one? Percentage of sales. Transportation is a percentage of sales, and you can see there it's only 3.6, whereas the others are 4% as a percentage of the sales. Do we focus on that, or do we look at we're reducing warehouse costs, because that's 4%? It will depend on how much you have in terms of the stock itself. If you're only dealing with 1 million, probably insignificant, but if you're dealing with 100 million, 4% versus 3.6 might be worth the effort. Remember the economies of effort from earlier on. Perfect example here of applying the DuPont pyramid. If you look at it there, you have all the sales, costs, cost of sales, cost of goods sold, and so on, and see how we start to build them all up, that pyramid, right down to giving us a return on equity, return on assets, and then the return on equity inside an organization, how efficiently our capital is working for us. So the high level analysis by the chief financial officer and so on, so they're only going to look at the high level figures. If they want it, they can delve down. So they're all linked. That's the whole point about it. So we can see. And if you have, for example, if you look at in this instance here, just by way of example, sales over sales, if they dropped, or one became, that started to drop, we can actually build trends in all of these. In some applications, I put this into an Excel sheet many years ago, but there are other versions out there. You can search them on the web yourself. But if there was something out of kilter, it'll turn red or orange. So you can put, as we say, the RAG system: red, amber, and green. So if everything is green, yeah, you're on the right trajectory. But if there was an overspend in one area, in a particular month, you can see it'll flash red or go orange. So it's an area, so we better watch this. What's happening here? Maybe there was some issue with Brexit caused a delay by 2 weeks, therefore our costs and storage and so on have gone up. Is this going to settle? So we'll watch that next month and the month after and so on to see if it's coming down. If not, then what do we need to put in place? You may be watching it weekly, depending on how sensitive it is. The whole point about it is using these systems, and they're automated. Having the IT in place will trigger you to start investigating, and that's all. And hence the responsibility, or the responsiveness, agility, and how we take actions to mitigate further downward trends in a particular area and improve the process. So financial implications of all of these: no problems if you have your orders fulfilled, but if we have service failure orders, so we haven't to change the order, rectify it, our orders were refused, and you can see revenue per order and then the loss. So the overall impact, if orders are refused, of course, will be that the total revenue will come down, plus all of the costs, which we have a whole other lecture on, in reverse logistics, and putting those mechanisms in place and so on, and outsourcing reverse logistics such that you're giving the service to customers and so on, so you reduce the returns insofar as you can. Invoice deduction per order. So, sometimes this can be as simple as someone inside in the sales department or in marketing say, look, I'll give you an extra 5% off that, which is outside. He might have had the brief to give him 2 or 3%, but just because it was a potentially big order, he has the flexibility to give a higher percentage discount and so on. So that could have a negative effect in terms of overall revenues, but at least you would be able to track it back if you're collecting the right data. And then, of course, all of this, the rehandling costs. So you can see there are so many different elements to service failure, anything from getting the wrong name on an invoice right down to because these are all done electronically. And if you have them miscoded and oftentimes problems are, one organization has a code for a product which has to be translated into a different code in another accounting system, and so on in a different company, in your customers, and that can be a real pain in the butt as well, because classifications and having consistent order numbers. Where there's something about that. Where did this come up? Yeah, it was it Boston Scientific or Medtronic? Yeah, there was from compliance, health and safety compliance, and FDA regulations and so on. There was some issue around the coding of certain products and so on, and why companies code them one way and different. So they were trying to come up with some kind of generic labeling or coding of particular products and components of products, such that there, for traceability. It's come back a few years now. It's just coming back to me. But that's the kind of thing we're facing as well. The amount of effort and getting agreement on these standards and so on. Here's just another example of the strategic profit model on an on-time delivery improvement. So that's only one element, an on-time delivery improvement. But you can see all the data that you can collect to either give you whether this was will it be a worthwhile effort? So you can use current data to try and predict the effect of changing a process. At that level, you're into the Six Sigma, level 5 or whatever, where you're using statistical analysis to predict the impact of a process, change in process, without actually doing it. Okay. And it makes perfect sense, because now we can say, right, if we do this, and this, the system is so. That's why as a Six Sigma guru, or as by way of consultant, you're looking at the guts of about 150 grand a year, because they know all this sort of stuff. And then you have the black belts and green belts, yellow belts, and different projects and so on. You're probably familiar. Some of you might have done these already in organizations. But at the ultimate, it's just level 5. I know in capability maturity modeling, it's pure statistical analysis. That's where your sums comes into play. So predicting the change and the effect of a process, of a change in process, way before you actually go down and implement it. And then you go and talk about implementing and test it, and then verify the data that you've predicted against the actual. And if they conform, then you know that your predictability model is it has been accurate and doesn't need any change, or it does need change. Other variables need to be put in. So we're constantly predicting, fine-tuning the hypothetical or scenario testing to give us more realistic understandings of what might be if we had physically made the change in the process as such. To follow my line of points here. But that's where it's going, because it takes less effort. It's only numbers. It's only a couple of people sitting down and doing this and says, if we make this change, these are the numbers that based on our hypothesis and scenario testing, and therefore, and these are the risks, because if we don't do this, so you have it all simulated before you actually go in and do it. It saves potential grief and so on and so forth. Is it worth the effort? Depends on what the strategic profit model is requiring in terms of profitability and so on. And again, don't go for the low-hanging fruit. That's always easy. You might start off with a couple of those to make sure that your system is working and your predictability models are working and so on and so forth. I'm not even going to mention NPHET and their predictability models and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's the DuPont pyramid in a format that shows you how you can put all of this together. And it's not overly complicated, seriously, if you pull it all down. Because when you're doing, have you got a finance model to do anywhere?
Yes, it was completed in semester 1.
Okay, so you all understand these. You understand the ratios and financial analysis.
Yeah.
Excellent. This is a walk in the park for you then. And that, folks, is the end of today's lecture. Excuse me. I don't need to read the summary charts. But suffice it to say that there's an awful lot in there. There's an awful lot, and understanding those finances and the multidimensionals, the responsiveness, the levels of data, understanding the data, trusting your intuition in many cases, and I'm just coming back to you. And
Mark, can you talk
yeah.
a little bit about kind of the implications that big data has put on supply chain? Like, I can see loads of pros from it, but like, what kind of cons has it added into, you know, that area of business?
The con of stupidity. What do I mean by that? You heard me mention a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And unfortunately, people get consumed by the concept of big data without understanding what actually makes it, what constitutes it. Now, we've gone through an overview of data metrics and indices and so on. That's part of the picture, because on top of that, you layer that with experience, which ultimately becomes knowledge. Or you can have, using the indices, gives you information, which then becomes experiential, which then becomes knowledge. Okay. Now, taking all of that, you have to be able to stand back. As I said, gut feeling is extremely important. Whether that's gathered through experience, predominantly it is. But data will tell you one thing. You have to have a feel or a sense for the business or the industry you're in, or whatever, to see that. Why is this data telling me one thing? My gut feeling tells me something slightly different. That's why putting all our faith into the pure data is, I would see, as the downside. So you need to understand how it's all put together. That's where we say dive down into the high, tall grass and start rummaging around and looking at what constitutes all that. Then, well, put it this way: you're all seeing NPHET data and so on for COVID data. Do you all believe the numbers? What are the questions you have about the numbers? What are the elephants in the room? There is stuff in there that's not sitting with some people, many people, I don't know, that doesn't kind of, I won't say it makes sense, but doesn't sound or feel right. And it doesn't. It isn't. I mean, this will all, a lot of this stuff will come out in the wash eventually when there's more thorough analysis and so on and so forth, and the data is made more freely available. Without having to go look for freedom of information. However, is it factually incorrect? Not necessarily. For example, well, we've got 200,000 COVID cases. There are not 200,000 COVID cases in the country. That's the running total. The real data that is of interest is how many active COVID cases are in the country, and how long are people experiencing COVID from, in terms of being struck down and then recovering to a level of normality. And at what level do we consider? Do we say it's 2 weeks? So break down your 2 week slices. What's the rolling average? That kind of number makes sense. In fairness to Michael O'Leary, he said, give us the numbers of how many vaccinations are coming, instead of the George Lee approach, and what's the other guy's name? I call him the notepad iPad, Fergal Bowers. And so, you know, it's almost like the four horsemen of the apocalypse come along, the dourness of their presentation. Why? Because it sells news. You know, it attracts the dark side of our nature. We're all more interested in looking at the negativity and dark news and blah, 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 than the positivity, because we get bored of positivity and so on. But the point about going around to it is, big data is one thing, understanding the structures and how it's all put together and having the trust. Remember, one of the very early points in the top side, facilitates trust. So if you skew or mess with the data and try and manipulate it in any shape or form, someone will question it, and it will become obvious that and you lose all trust. You know, as I said, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. Of course, you can make things look differently with statistics and so on and so forth. But as you become more aware of the complexities and intricacies of gathering data and so on and so forth, then you will question the statistics, and then you say, well, this hasn't been taken into account, that hasn't been, so it's very narrow. So for example, doing a poll of 1,000 people to support a particular opinion, where was the poll done? In Dublin only? What about all the people outside the M50, for example, if you're talking about transportation and so on and so on and so on? So again, gathering the data, that's why when you go on to do your dissertations for at master's level, MBA, whatever it is, this whole area of data collection becomes so important to validate your assumptions, your findings, and your thesis itself. Because if it's anyway sketchy, then it falls flat in its face. One guy I knew, he was the year ahead of me in Oxford, a Polish guy. He was with Boston Scientific. He actually moved to Medtronic and then to another medical device company, beginning with E. Okay. Anyway, he wrote his whole dissertation on one interview, and said, how the hell was that possible? Because the process around the research methodology, he presented such a solid, watertight case that this one interview was representative of the mass Polish group in Ireland. So the process and the data are extremely. So if you don't have the process in place, you better have a broad range of data to be able to pick from, to be able to argue a case. And most of the time you'll be using surveys, questionnaires, and so on and so forth. But the sampling becomes important then. That gives you an understanding of why and where big data then becomes. So the big data is just literally pulling information from multiple sources and storing it and so on and so forth. And the fact that we can try and draw linkages between all the different variables, and both dependent and independent variables. The going down in Leopardstown today might be soft to hard, or soft to squishy, or whatever the hell they call it, and so on. Independent variables might be, what's the weather forecast for tomorrow? And then you see the dependency of that weather forecast and how it could impact on the Leopardstown thingy going on, whatever. But you have, and quite often the gap between dependent and independent variables can be quite large, and sometimes it can be so large that you mightn't even see the independent variables, but you have a feeling there's a possibility that this could have an impact, how big or how small. So this is why we kind of look at these big data. And there is actually my own presentation to the supply chain management conference down in City West there 3 years ago, whatever. That's already up on YouTube, highlighting where and how we could collect data. And in one example, I've going back to my own pet hobby and so on, for passion, call it what you will, cycling. I have chest monitor for heart rate. I have my pedals that gives me RPMs. I have a thing on the wheel that gives me the speed I'm traveling at. And I have power meters on my pedal to give me indication of how much power I'm pushing out from two legs. So 4 sensors. The amount of data that generates is, again, you classify it as big data. Put it all together over time, I can see trends. You're improving or not improving. You're doing this, and you're doing, and I can go right down to see why is my left leg stronger than my right leg, for example, and why is it consistently? How often is this happening? And as a result, that's how I ended up getting knee surgery 3 weeks ago for a complex tear in the meniscus and an abnormal skin fold. Could I have seen that coming? Absolutely not. But something triggered in the data said, this isn't right because I'm right-handed and right-footed. With all this data, that it started me thinking and questioning why things are happening in a particular way. Then a visit to the doctor, bang, pull the two of them together, and the net result is I'm limping around for the last 2 weeks. It's on the mend. It'll be fine. It's on the keyhole surgery. But you see how data, and that's only on a small level, but it's the volume and diversity of the data that was collected that gave me indicators and trends, and I could see that things weren't happening. And that's why I said understanding the numbers, understanding how they're structured, where they're coming from, and what's important. What you know, in this case, I could see that, you know, heart rate was up and there, and this, that, there, all of that sort of stuff. You know, you begin to get an overall picture, in my case, of relative fitness and performance, and the rate at which I should have been performing versus what was actually happening, predictability, and so on. So that's why understanding the data, pulling all the data together, and making sense of it from multiple perspectives. And who would have even thought that it was that there was even an issue with, you know, anyway, that's just by way of example, and that's how it all panned out. Does that kind of answer what you were asking, Emma?
Yes, thank you, Mark.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, or insults, folks? Well, I shouldn't say insults. I don't accept insults. Any other questions or?
Do you think the pandemic and Brexit have changed supply chain, or is it only temporarily? You know, the way people couldn't get supplies for so long, are they going to look closer to home?
It has. It's most definitely have an impact on supply chain. A lot of it. Two things I look at this is that, first of all, the stupidity of what's after happening, because people were forewarned and they should have been forearmed in many cases. Secondly, the processes hadn't been properly trialed or tested out, and the implications, so the knock-on effect, so the risk analysis wasn't quite effective. They're beginning to settle down somewhat. People have found workarounds, so to speak. And now that it's been pointed out how problematic these things, the politicians will start to get involved again and say, well, how can we undo some of this and make it a little bit more fluid, or bring it back to some level of fluidity of previous setups and so on. So, but the problem is time. And you know, how long does it take for people to learn from a lesson and so on, is that's what I particularly find frustrating in this whole thing. There will be exploitation. If we have to take different routes and use different supply channels, they will inevitably involve newer, parameters and potentially additional costs. Then it has, again, as I said in the previous lecture, we'll have to look at ways of some way of trying to become more partnered and help hopefully reduce those costs over time. But you know, I would probably be a bit more of an optimist than a pessimist. There's always a solution to every problem, as I always say. It's just a case of how hard and how quickly we find that solution.
Thanks.
Okay. I just need to check chat. I don't have chat open because I get so involved in my lectures that I don't actually read all of the
It's gratitude, Mark.
Yeah. Okie dokie, folks. On that note, I'll call. Again, it's all recorded. I'll throw it up on YouTube if you want to go back and pull out any of the key points out of what we were saying as well there. You know. Alrighty, folks. We'll see you on Wednesday night.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thanks,
Mark.
Mark.
Cheers.
God bless.
Thanks very
Bye-bye.
much.
You're welcome. Bye.